3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11.
All right, welcome to Roots of Reality. I'm your host, and today's topic is 1960s nostalgia. So the 1960s were quite an interesting time to be alive historically. It was an era of hippie culture and the peace and love movement. And of course, this was a generation literally shaped by the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, where people still feared nuclear annihilation. On top of this, to make matters even crazier, the Vietnam War was ongoing during the entire 60s, where parents back in the United States were worried about their sons being drafted into a war that wasn't the United States war to fight. However, much like the political moment today, it was an era that was quite politically polarizing for Americans. You had older generations that were more inclined to support the Vietnam War, while younger generations who were getting drafted were against it. After all, being an 18-year-old in America at the time, you were old enough to be drafted and sent to die in Vietnam, but not old enough to drink alcohol. On top of this, it was an era also shaped by the confrontation of the United States' long issues with racism, which were finally seriously being challenged with the civil rights movement led by Martin Luther King Jr., a movement that would finally end racist segregation laws in American society and begin integrating the country. And of course, like Vietnam, this too was a major polarizing issue where some Americans still held on to this ethnic-based tribalism where they feared mixing with other ethnic groups in the country. And just when you think things can't get even worse from here, you also had major assassinations that rocked the nation. For example, American President John F. Kennedy was killed in 1963 by Lee Harvey Oswald. Later, Kennedy's brother, American Senator Robert Kennedy, would also be assassinated in 1968. And the civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr. would be assassinated. And when it comes to crime in general in the country at the time, crime rates were pretty high and increasing, and it was an era with lots of recreational drug use. So in many ways, the 60s were a time of utter madness for the U.S. politically, where many societal problems were causing great challenges for the American people. Underneath the chaos, though, culture still thrived as people made the best of a chaotic world, as we so often do. Because though the people of the 60s faced many issues, the resilience of the people still showed by producing cultural moments and memories that will always be embedded in the history of our species. After all, this was the most exciting time in history for space exploration. Because as the Cold War between the United States and Soviet Union was ongoing, it also produced some of the greatest feats in human history due to this competition between the two societies. Also, the 1960s produced lots of iconic music. For instance, the British band The Beatles would come to the United States and take the music scene by storm, creating a huge cultural moment that is often called the British Invasion and Beatlemania. However, you also had music groups and musicians like the Supremes, the Four Seasons, Jimi Hendrix, the Beach Boys, Bob Dylan, the Rolling Stones, the Association, David Bowie, Neil Diamond, Bob Marley, Dolly Parton, Rod Stewart, Pink Floyd, Santana, Led Zeppelin, the Jackson 5, The Who, and the Temptations. As for fashion, tie-dye shirts were popular, as well as mini skirts for girls, and hairstyles like crew cuts, mop tops, and afros. And who could forget the iconic peace symbol? As for sports globally in the 1960s, the Olympics in this decade was dominated by the United States and the Soviet Union, continuing that Cold War rivalry. And as for soccer, Brazil and England would both win a World Cup, and the Italian soccer teams AC Milan and Inter Milan would dominate the European Champions League, the best soccer league in the world. As for basketball, it was an era of dominance by the Boston Celtics, led by stars Bob Cousy, Bill Russell, and John Havlicek. And for professional hockey, Canadian teams like the Montreal Canadiens and the Toronto Maple Leafs were becoming the Stanley Cup champions again and again. Now switching over to American football, the 60s featured legends like Coach Vince Lombardi and players like Gale Sayers, Bart Starr, Johnny Unitas, and Jim Brown, who were looked up to by kids all across America. Then in professional golf, it was an era of Jack Nicklaus, and in boxing, it was the era of Muhammad Ali. And lastly, as for America's pastime baseball, greats like Hank Aaron, Ernie Banks, Roberto Clemente, and Mickey Mantle all became legends. Turning towards Hollywood now, there were also many iconic movies and TV shows that would come out in the 1960s, including films like the 2001 Space Odyssey, Breakfast at Tiffany's, The Sound of Music, Dr. Strangelove, Lawrence of Arabia, Mary Poppins, Night of the Living Dead, The Pink Panther, Planet of the Apes, Psycho, Spartacus, West Side Story, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, and TV shows like Star Trek, Doctor Who, The Twilight Zone, The Dick Van Dyke Show, Gunsmoke, The Andy Griffith Show, Gilligan's Island, Mission Impossible, The Flintstones, Bewitched, and of course The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. As for famous actors of this era, it included people like Clint Eastwood, Marlon Brando, Mel Brooks, Sean Connery, Bill Cosby, Jane Fonda, Marilyn Monroe, Dean Martin, Bruce Lee, Bob Hope, Dustin Hoffman, Audrey Hepburn, Gene Hackman, Judy Garland, Leonard Nimoy, Mickey Rooney, William Shatner, Frank Sinatra, Adam West, and Brigitte Bardot. And so with all these cultural contributions from the 1960s, whether coming from the United States or Europe or somewhere else in the world, it would be an era that would lead to nostalgia for generations to come. Thus, these 1960s cultural moments for those 60s kids today is a nostalgia that still lingers. We're adults now who are the age of grandparents are looking back at their childhoods, as we all end up doing at some point in our lives, wondering where the time went. However, as time keeps chugging along, the 60s youth can look back and be proud of the cultural impact their generation had in the midst of troubled times. After all, 60s culture is still prevalent and influential today in many ways. For example, the music is still regularly played, and many kids have heard of the Beatles, Muhammad Ali, and Star Trek, and more, reminding us all that sometimes the gap between generations isn't as big as we think. Thus, with that, the memory just remains. So with that, remember, billions of years led to you, so make the most of it.